We're live. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining another STEM Women Hangout on Air. And today we're speaking to Professor Chad Forbes from the University of Delaware. And we're talking about stereotype threat with Chad, who is a social neuroscientist. So, as usual, let's dive straight into the questions. So stereotype threat is something, it describes the pressure that minorities face when they're judged against negative stigma about their group. For example, the idea that, girls are not good at maths or people of color can't do science. So can you start by generally explaining what is social neuroscience and tell us how neuroscience can explain stereotype threat?
Yeah, sure. First off, thanks for having me. This is a lot of fun and a pleasure, and I feel honored. So thanks, and I hope I hope I can keep people engaged. I don't know. Yeah. So anyway, so to speak to your question, social neuroscience is a burgeoning field that utilizes neuroscience methodologies like electroencephalography or EEG. Functional magnetic resonance imaging, we call it fMRI, genetics, really any kind of thing that indexes neural activity, transcranial magnetic stimulation, so on. It uses these methodologies to inform social psychological theory and our hypotheses. There's a counter to that too, in that an element of the field where we can also utilize these kind of our social theories and hypotheses and the power of the situation, more importantly, to also inform understanding of how the brain works and how the brain works in these in different contexts and how different situations can really facilitate a dynamic shift in interaction and how different neural networks work together, and that kind of provides us with an understanding of brain function in general. Specific to stereotype threat, the social neuroscience approach can help in two primary ways. Basically, one of the most important is these methods allow us to examine different psychological phenomenon via neural processes that are thought to instantiate them online or while people are actually engaged in a given task. So this means that we can index their reactions to different things or different cognitive processes when they're actually doing something. And we don't have to rely as much on their kind of general interpretations of the situation post hoc or after the experiment is done. This also kind of along those lines too. Social neuroscience also allows us to kind of get around, allows us to index how the stigmatized individuals might be feeling or how they might be interpreting different stimuli that they may not otherwise be either conscious of or realize that it's going on, or they might not be willing to share for various reasons. And this is really important with regards to stereotype threat because a lot of times stereotype threatened individuals don't really realize that they're experiencing stereotype threat, and they walk away thinking that nothing really happened, or there wasn't anything unique about that situation per se, but how their brains are responding and how their brains look during while they're doing these different tasks would suggest otherwise. So we can utilize these neuroscience methodologies to index a lot of things, but specifically, it really provides good insight into things like attention and memory and emotion regulation and things like that.
Thanks for that, Chad. So if you were to give us a couple of more specific examples, so how might you actually measure how stereotype threat affects women and minorities specifically in STEM?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the basic effect is, just to kind of familiarize the audience, the basic effect is when there are situations where, say, men outnumber women, or a majority group outnumbers a minority group, or other situations where stigmatized women or minorities are told that they're going to complete something like the SAT or GRE task, the graduate record exam, or the scholastic aptitude test, and then mark their gender or ethnicity before they do that. When people are placed in these kinds of situations, among others, they tend to underperform on whatever task they're going to engage in. So stereotype threat offers a really it's a nice counter to other theories that argue maybe there's some kind of biological element to why minority groups or women specifically might underperform on these different tasks, because they show that when you don't put these individuals in these specific situations, for instance, if you put them in a gender-neutral environment or equal numbers of minority and majority members, or you don't ask them to mark their gender or their race, then they perform comparably on these tests to everybody else. So the first wave of stereotype threat research was concerned with who was actually susceptible to stereotype threat effects, and really the answer was pretty pronounced, or pretty clear. It was anyone who has a negative stereotype that's attributed to their group could be susceptible to underperforming on whatever task that they're completing that's in the stigmatized domain. So the second wave of stereotype threat research then has been more concerned with what exactly happens. Why do people succumb to these kind of situational stressors or threats? And what that research is revealing is that the answer is complicated, but stereotype threat engenders a cascade of physiological stress responses, negative appraisals, and performance monitoring processes that can work either alone or in concert to tax working memory specifically, which is a cognitive process that people use all the time, right? You can think of it as any time you're trying to remember a phone number for a specific amount of time, and you're tying your shoes or engaging in other activities, and you want to say what that phone number is later on. Well, that process is also really important when you solve things like math word problems. So it turns out that stereotype threat seems to tax working memory resources in the stigmatized specifically, but it also does lots of other stuff. For instance, it increases anxiety, it increases physiological arousal, it makes people more hypervigilant for mistakes that they're making or for stereotype confirming evidence. It increases the level of worry and concern and negative cognitions that they have during the testing situation. It lowers their expectations. It changes their effort. It can either increase or decrease it. It increases mind wandering. It alters self-regulatory processes. So really, it does a lot. The stereotype threat kind of has a really pronounced effect on people. And it's also important, too, that it's not just specific to performance either. There's also a more kind of general umbrella term referred to as social identity threat that doesn't involve performance per se. It's more of like just when people are placed in these different situations that I had described before, and they just kind of start getting worried that that person might be perceiving them in more of a negative stereotypic manner, and that alters behavior and cognition accordingly.
So just to make it really clear, so why, I mean, it's sort of obvious that, you know, women and racial minorities are minorities within the sciences and in technology. So why would stereotype threat work with them in particular and, say, not affect men or white people as much?
Yeah, so I mean, this is all of this stems from the actual stereotype or the expectations that a given society has kind of developed over time. So the answer to that is really straightforward in that these groups have negative stereotypes applied to them. So women aren't expected to be as good at math as men. Minorities aren't expected to be as good in math or even in these measures of intelligence. And it's interesting because actually, so people kind of protest when I say things like that often. But I mean, to this day, we do this like pre-test here at Delaware. I did it at Arizona when I was there. We always ask, like, we're not asking what your opinion is, but what do you think society's opinion is about these groups? How do you think society expects men or women to perform on these different tests? And it's overwhelming. The overwhelming distribution is people still identify men with being better at math and whites being more intelligent than other groups, other ethnic groups. And so stereotype threat argues that it's those expectations specifically that lead to this kind of cascade of responses that I was talking about. So if a white person or a male taking a math test, when they're placed in these situations, they don't have those expectations. In fact, if anything, they're expected to do a little bit better. And there's some research that suggests that actually leads to this kind of stereotype lift phenomenon where they do a little bit better on these tests compared to minority groups or women.
Is there ever a situation where the burden of that stereotype works against them? So, for example, you're expected to perform well because you are white and male, and oh crap, so much pressure. I'm supposed to be doing well. Does that ever happen as well?
There's not a whole lot of evidence of that. If anything, so the typical response is they just kind of do the same. So you stick, like, you know, and most of our studies will have a stereotype threat condition, and we'll have a control condition, a stereotype neutral condition, and so men will be in both of those conditions, and usually they just perform similar to one another. So there's not like this huge boost, just like there's not necessarily like any kind of deficit from choking or something like that. Although there is a choking literature that suggests, you know, people will choke under those situations for various reasons. But those effects are far less pronounced than they are with regards to stereotype threat and women and minorities or any threatened group that you're talking about.
Yeah, it's very interesting because you're measuring something that doesn't, you know, it's hard to quantitate confidence and things like that, but that's what your research is. And you were recently awarded a National Science Foundation Award to extend your research, and you're looking at motivation, attention, and memory. So can you tell us a bit about how you're planning on conducting this research? What are your methods for, you know, quantitatively looking at this?
Yeah, so so what I do is I study how stereotype threat, at a basic level, I study how stereotype threat affects attention to stereotype confirming evidence at kind of a fundamental level, and then we look at what are the kind of downstream consequences of that kind of biased neural response. So, for instance, in a paper we just had published recently, we had women completing a math test. And they were told that it was either diagnostic of their math intelligence, like a SAT type test, and we had them mark their gender, or we told them that it was just a problem-solving task, and we're going to look at what types of problems they like to solve and things like that, and then they don't mark their gender. Importantly, we would give them feedback after every problem that they solved to see what was the brain's response to this type of feedback. And basically what we found was that as early as about 75 milliseconds after being exposed to this feedback, women under stereotype threat showed this really biased response towards the negative feedback specifically. So brain regions that are really important for attention and working memory were communicating better with one another in response to this negative compared to positive feedback. And also we saw some interesting activity in regions that are pretty integral for even just kind of processing the word at a basic level. And what was interesting along those lines was we actually found that when women had this kind of more pronounced response in this particular brain region to the negative feedback, that actually undermined their performance on the task. So the more power they elicited to this wrong feedback in this area, the more neural activity they elicited to this wrong feedback, the worse they did on the test that they were taking. And that didn't happen when they were looking at correct feedback. And women in the stereotype neutral context actually kind of showed the reverse response. They were showing a little bit more bias towards the positive feedback, if anything. So again, this is all happening like super fast, which is kind of crazy to think about. So where we're going with that then, with regards to the grant, is saying, okay, well, what are the downstream consequences of that then? So these words are literally kind of like popping out to them, like this negative feedback kind of really sticks out of the crowd, and they're attending to it more, and their brains are processing it more efficiently. Then does that actually mean that they're going to remember certain aspects of these stereotype threatening situations differently compared to when they're in these stereotype neutral situations? So in the grant, we're looking at we have kind of three aspects to the grant. And the first aspect, we're interested in how women encode or remember negative feedback specifically in stereotype threatening situations. So some work we have under review right now, for instance, has shown that when we would bring women into the lab, women and men, and we would tell them we would put them under stereotype threat or not, and then they would complete this what we call a math font task. And what that means is they would solve these problems that weren't like overly hard, but they weren't like really easy either. So they would kind of require working memory resources and things like that to solve. what we would do is we would give them meaningful feedback, but we would change how the feedback looks. So I have a very rudimentary example of like what they might see, but for instance, if they're solving a certain math problem and they get it wrong, we would show them like the word wrong on the computer screen that was written in like that kind of font. Or they might see on another trial, they might see wrong written in like a font like that, right? And we would do the same thing for correct feedback. And everyone had equal chances of seeing, you know, the feedback written in a specific font. And then we gave them a difficult GRE test where we could index the actual real threat effect that we try to look at for a manipulation check, basically. And then we gave them a surprise memory test. And we showed them all of those fonts that they saw during the task, be they correct or wrong. And then we showed them some things that they hadn't seen to kind of get at whether they were guessing or not. And basically what we found was that women, when they were under stereotype threat, they showed this enhanced recall for those wrong the fonts that were written in the wrong feedback specifically. So they didn't show this kind of bias towards the correct feedback, like those types of fonts. It was specific to the wrong feedback. And then we had them do some anxiety measures just to see how they kind of felt afterwards. And what we found across 3 studies was that when women were under stereotype threat, they actually exhibited this better memory for the negative feedback that they saw in the font task. One interesting caveat to that is that test, like I said, it wasn't necessarily hard, and you usually have to give people hard tests to bring out these threat effects. They actually performed comparable to men, but they were still remembering the negative information better than men or the positive information. But their encoding of those words then actually predicted how they were performing on the future math test, and then that predicted how much anxiety they were experiencing. So we kind of found this indirect link between remembering this negative information specifically and actually kind of undermining performance on a more difficult task that would normally elicit threat effects, and then how they kind of walked out of the situation not feeling too great about themselves, feeling more anxious. And what I like about those findings, or what I think are really interesting, is they go nicely with this recent meta-analysis that Elsquest, Hyde, and Lin just published. And in this meta-analysis, it's a really cool meta-analysis. They had 493,000 boys and girls that they surveyed worldwide, or they obtained their kind of math attitudes and their math confidence, as well as their performance on these standardized math tests. And what they found was that the differences between boys and girls on how they performed on this math test varied from either they were equal or pretty close to not performing, to girls underperforming compared to boys, that actually seemed to be moderated by how misogynistic a culture the women were reared in. So they had this kind of equal performance, right, overall, or really similar. But where women did systematically differ was in how confident they felt towards math and how much they liked math. So our findings kind of complement that nicely, suggesting like even if people are performing comparably to one another, when women are in these stereotype threatening situations, they're encoding that negative stereotype confirming evidence that they're receiving differently, and that's kind of having these downstream consequences for how they feel in the domain. So we're in the first grant study, we're kind of extending upon that and looking at more of the neural mechanisms that are involved, specifically regions of the brain that are involved in processing emotion and visceral arousal and stress, and trying to provide a direct link between that. So then the second aspect of the grant then looks more at how these memories then can kind of lay the groundwork for a basic STEM aversion that women might develop towards the STEM domain. And this is important. It's important to note I'm talking more about like kind of women that are earlier on in the process, maybe like high school girls or girls just starting college, right? This isn't like necessarily, we don't think this doesn't necessarily happen in like faculty members or grad students, like people who had more evidence of success over time. So we're looking at these basic STEM aversions that develop, and so those kinds of ideas are also being motivated by different findings from our lab. One of which being, so going back to that study with the different fonts, we actually found also in another study that so we would have women and men do that same setup at time 1, and then they would actually come back a week later and all we would do was put them under stereotype threat again, and then give them that surprise memory test, and we tested their memory for this font that they saw one time in a week before. And what we found was basically that women would spontaneously recall these the negative feedback specifically, so they were more likely to remember that negative feedback. But this was only among those women who cared the most, which is another kind of ironic consequence of stereotype threat, is that usually the women who are most susceptible to this phenomenon are the ones who care the most. They want to do well. They want to succeed. They want to be in the STEM domain. So we think that when women find themselves in these contexts repeatedly, every time you find yourself in that classroom or in that same testing situation, you're going to spontaneously retrieve these memories, and that's going to promote anxiety and things like that. And so we have some studies that kind of index that as well, that suggest that when you put women in these, you show women pictures of like gender neutral versus kind of gender unbalanced pictures, that kind of hijacks resources and elicits this aversive response that can also then predict like underperformance on math tests and things like that.
It's interesting because what you're saying really makes me think about some of the research that we had Dr. Inga Newman talking about how PhD women navigate administrative processes throughout their candidature, and also how they deal with their supervisors. And one thing she was saying is that women don't really know, that they feel like they're constantly being judged. So even mundane tasks like filling out a progress report, which men don't really think about, women feel like that might be used against them. And so I think one way, so I see a lot of overlap in what you're saying, in that women constantly feel judged, and that impacts on their ability to succeed. And I think sometimes, there's been this movement towards if women just are more confident, if women just ask for more help, and that really places the onus back on women. But I think what your research and Inga's research shows is actually that it's the individual experiences that women face from when they're little, and all the institutional barriers that they face. That's something that we keep coming back to. So I think it's easy for people to say that that's probably women should just relax, or that maybe women are just, biologically more stressed, but I don't think that that's what your research would suggest. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. No, I would disagree with that statement if anyone ever said that. No, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the whole premise of stereotype threat is that it's a situational phenomenon that's the result of a socialization process. It's this society that we're reared in that forges these perceptions that we have towards others, and that really sets the stage at any given point in time for some really a lot of things that we're just completely unaware of, right? Because if you're going through a society where these things are kind of deemed as the norm, or these perceptions are kind of almost perceived as fact or something, then then it doesn't occur to you that, well, if there's another society where this isn't happening, right, then there's a completely different phenomenon unfolding, right? It's I'm a big proponent of we're all humans, right? We all have the same wiring, and it just those wires get wired up differently based on the culture that you're reared in.
So your research, you're also doing some really interesting research where you kind of tease out stereotype threat in terms of social relations, and you look at the concepts of in-groups and out-groups. Can you tell us how these concepts might help us to explain how bias comes about and how it's reproduced?
Yeah, it's all of this stuff is like we could have like a class on this. I mean, like a semester-long class to talk about all the factors that play into these types of things. But yeah, just in terms of basic in-group, out-group research, again, social neuroscience and social psychology in general speaks volumes about these types of things, and documents how insidious these kind of social constructs can become, both in how we interact with others and how we perceive others who are not like us. So I mean, with regards to STEM and basic bias, I was thinking of a good way to to kind of demonstrate this, and I thought of one of my favorite studies. There was a study done by Jack DeVideo and Kerry Kawakami and Sam Gertner, who are big, real prominent social psychologists. It was a really elegant but simple study. Basically, they just had intergroup interactions. In this case, it was white participants interacting with black Confederates, and that interaction was being watched by, or they were recorded and they were watched later by these independent coders who didn't really know what was going on. And all they did was they got the white person, the white subjects, they got their explicit attitudes towards blacks, so how they explicitly reported feeling, how much they liked black individuals, and then they got a measure of their implicit bias, which is these kind of basic associations that people form between everything, right? We have these really basic positive or negative affinities towards everything from people to different cars or music, right? It's just these things that are automatically activated whenever we come in contact with a group member or whatever attitude object we call it. And they looked at and then they had these two individuals interact, and they looked at what predicted what predicted the whites' perceptions of how the interaction went, and what predicted the blacks' perceptions of how the interaction went. And so basically what they found was, not surprisingly, when whites thought the interaction went about as well as their explicit attitude predicted. So if they liked blacks, then they thought the interaction went great. If they didn't like blacks explicitly, they thought the interaction didn't go so well. And they thought that they were more or less friendly, respectively, too. But that didn't really matter with how the black person kind of walked away from the situation. For them, it was all about the whites' implicit bias that they had, this kind of bias that they theoretically don't really have a real awareness for. And specifically, what those implicit biases predicted was the white person's nonverbal behaviors. So how far away they sat away from the black person, how much eye contact they made, how many speech stammers they made. Those kinds of things predicted the black and the independent coder. It affected how friendly they thought the person was and how great they thought the interaction went. So if the person had more implicit bias, they thought that the black Confederate walks away thinking, that guy sucked. That was a really lame interaction. But that's independent then of how the white person's walking away, right? Because if they have this positive explicit attitude, then they walk away thinking that went great. What a nice interaction. So I think that nicely captures the kind of dichotomy and the complexity that's embedded within these in-group, out-group interactions, right? And we see lots of examples of that with respect to women in STEM. The implicit bias and kind of the role that plays in really undermining how we perceive others, how men might perceive women in these different contexts, how it's coloring their perceptions unbeknownst to them, how it's affecting their nonverbal behaviors, and then that bears out in these interesting field studies where they would look where Tony Schmader and Matthias Mell and their colleagues looked at how male and female STEM faculty members interacted with one another over the course of a week, and what they found was that men would talk to other men about research a lot, right? But they wouldn't really talk to women about that. What they would talk to women about was their social life, like how was their weekend, what were they doing this weekend, or how are the kids, or something like that. And what the kind of crazy consequence of that was that the extent to which men would do that, or the extent to which they would even talk about research to women, predicted the women's disidentification with their job. It basically predicted them having less interest in kind of continuing on. So again, that's another kind of interesting example where you can have two people interacting, and the researcher thinks that they're being nice and that they're trying to reach out to the person and they're trying to help them out, but it's having this kind of negative ramifications that they might not necessarily be aware of. Sorry if I'm yapping a lot.
No, that's fine. It's really interesting and completely outside my area of research. So I'm like, that's very interesting, and you have a captivated audience, basically.
You can tell me to just stick a sock in it.
No. I think that one thing we face a lot because we do quite a lot of science moderation for the public in different spheres, and people are really reluctant to first of all do away with the biological narrative to explain gender differences, but also I think people are really reluctant to own their own biases, and it is confronting, because most people don't walk around thinking I'm sexist or I'm racist, because it's obviously not an okay thing to think. But I think people really are very unwilling to look at how their unconscious behavior, and as you're saying, even body language, the way they speak, what they speak about, how all of these contribute to the marginalization of women and minorities.
That's a much better way to say what I said for the last 5 minutes.
Yeah. One of the things that I find interesting, and we get this a lot, like Zuleika mentioned, that, you know, the differences, that girls just don't like math, not because, you know, they're girls, not because of, like, society or stereotypes, but because, oh, ovaries, oh, estrogen, you know. And you have a molecular biology background, you studied it, and you volunteered in a genetics lab. So can you tell us a bit about how your research addresses these myths that it's not nature and it's actually nurture?
Yeah, well, I think that's my research really kind of really has a definitive example of that, right? I mean, it's really clear in a couple ways. One is, you know, that I do look at these neural biomarkers. So I actually, you know, I'm tracking like how people's brains are responding in these different situations and how they're working. And you know, our research is really clear and really straightforward in demonstrating that when women are in this stereotype neutral context, right, this situation where they're not reminded of this stigmatized identity or this expectation that they're not supposed to do as well, their brains look surprisingly, or not very surprisingly, maybe, look identical to male brains, right? They're doing the same thing. The brains are working in the same way. Solving problems, for instance, is very similar. But just a subtle tweak in that environment, right? That sends people down a different rabbit hole, right? That gets the brain working in a different way, and so that clearly speaks to this notion that just priming these different things that you may not necessarily be aware of alters the neural function and how brains respond. But when it's not there, when those situations aren't construed in that way, then it's the same.
So what are some of the practical outcomes of your research, Chad, that we can apply to make this better and improve gender and racial diversity in STEM?
Yeah, so hopefully there's a lot of good stuff that comes out of this. So the grant itself, you know, is designed to test this model that we have for why women disidentify with STEM domains, and the good news is, you know, the bad news is I think it's a really complicated process, but the good news is I think there's a lot of areas where you can attack, and so there's the last aspect of our study actually is concerned with that, like the kind of counterattacks that people can employ. I obviously think that a really important aspect is to blunt that basic arousal response somehow, and there's different ways that you can do that. You could, and one of them being, you know, some kind of like different cognitive reappraisals of the situation, looking at things as a challenge as opposed to, like, you know, this concern that you're going to be evaluated in this domain. There's different kind of self-enhancing things that people can engage in to kind of, again, buffer themselves from these self-threats that stereotype threatening situations evoke. And we're even kind of tinkering with some mindfulness-related things in our lab. Just being aware that the people are having these kind of differential responses to these different types of stimuli or these different types of thoughts that they might be having. And we have some really interesting research to suggest there's already kind of a individual difference variable involved in terms of how regions of the brain that are important for helping people regulate themselves and kind of cope with different situations, the extent to which those regions kind of interact with one another, even just at rest before they engage in a task. That predicts like how they walk out of the situation feeling. And so if they have kind of better connectivity between these regions, this was with minorities specifically, then they walk away thinking that they performed perfectly fine on the intelligence test, and they felt pretty good about themselves. Whereas if they don't have this connectivity, it's the opposite. They think they did a lot worse than they actually did, and they feel really they experience a lot of self-doubt. So we're looking at we're targeting things like that as ways that would be simple, but also potentially effective in reversing some of these. And of course, one of the best ways that's been uncovered through past research so far by my colleagues is telling people about this stuff, telling them that these things exist. That if you perform poorly on that test or something, it might not necessarily be because it might not have anything to do with your talent in the field or your ability to do math. It might be the fact that you're in this classroom with a bunch of guys or something like that, and that's having this kind of insidious effect on you outside of your awareness.
Yeah, that's something I wish I knew earlier. I mean, it's the sort of thing that I only got to find out over the past few years, and I wish this sort of thing gets talked about more at younger stages in high school level math tests, even before that. I think that could make a huge difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
So your research will look at how genetic and neural patterns affect cognitive bias and behavior, allowing you to look at groups that discriminate, as well as the subgroups among women and minorities who end up leaving STEM, leaking out of the pipeline, so to speak. Can you tell us how you plan to carry out this work?
Yeah, so this will all be specific to the grant that we're doing and the models that I'm testing in there. So every study that we have in our grant is going to incorporate EEG methodology. So we'll constantly be monitoring neural activity and also then subsequently the interaction between these different neural networks that we think are really important in these processes or in these situations. We can track how these things change in these different contexts. And then we also have people. We're collecting DNA from everybody, anybody who participates in the study. So it should be particularly cool. We're going to build quite an impressive data set. We'll have hundreds and hundreds of people with all EEG activity and these different single nucleotide polymorphisms that we're interested in that also alter how the brain kind of gets wired up and how neuroplasticity specifically is either promoted or stifled. And so we're looking at those. We're looking at the genetic SNPs, the single nucleotide polymorphisms, as more of like a moderator for these different effects, where that might either exacerbate or attenuate the threat effect and the processing of this, the encoding of this negative information. But then we're also going to look at then how that maps onto neural function via the EEG signal that we record throughout.
Yeah, I guess there's also the possibility that if you have a woman who, undergoes really severe stereotype threat, those changes, they might not just be SNPs. I mean, you could have epigenetic recordings of that sort of thing. I mean, mice remember trauma and they pass on that information to their offspring. So you might even find out that stereotype threat can be inherited through a genetic basis like that. I think that would be quite interesting to unravel. Yeah,
that would be pretty crazy. But I mean, it's certainly. I mean, I don't mean that in that could be awesome, and you'll see my my article in Science if that happens, I think. But but at the same time, at the same time, it's that's I really like the genetic aspect, and I'm interested in that. I'm really interested in epigenetics too, and we have some researchers here at Delaware that do that specifically. But it's also really important to think about, gosh, we're looking at one gene in amongst millions, and it's crazy. It's going to be really complicated, I think, right? Like, I don't know if it'll be one gene or one kind of. It
probably won't be one gene, but it probably might be a kind of epigenetic modification pattern that is different between control versus stereotype threat. And I don't know, I'm just imagining stuff here.
No, I totally agree, and that's kind of one thing that my research kind of purports, or one underlying message is, I think this is again, it's just the brain. Like, we don't have a stereotype threat region of the brain, right? But we have a part of the brain that responds to stress. And so any research we conduct that informs our understanding of epigenetic influences on stress and genes and under stress, like a lot of the PTSD research is starting to kind of investigate, I think that will have ramifications for these types of things as well. It's all part of the same system.
So I think we're almost out of time. We have actually gone over time because we've been enjoying our chat so much,
Yes.
Chad. Did you have anything else that you wanted to add before we wrap things up?
I wanted to thank you again very much for doing this, and I really appreciate what you're doing in general with your efforts to promote our understanding of all these different phenomena that affect people. And yeah, keep up the good work.
Thank you. Thanks, Chad. Thanks for your time, and thank you to all our viewers as well for tuning in as always. We'll be back in another fortnight to talk more about STEM women, so keep a lookout, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel if you want updates about our videos. And I hope that you all have a really great week, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.